What if I told you that by doing nothing, some of our most trusted leaders, government leaders, law enforcement leaders, and yes, even our church leaders, are guilty as those who commit atrocities against animals? Their inaction is a betrayal of their roles and a failure to honor God's call to protect all living things. Stay with me because today we will expose this indifference and hold them accountable not just in the eyes of the public but in the eyes of the Lord. Hello, I am Dr. Mark McMorris Jr., animal advocate, longtime animal rescuer, published author, investigative journalist, former deputy sheriff dedicated to saving lives and promoting compassion for all of God's creations. With over a decade of experience in animal welfare, I have seen firsthand the consequences of inaction and indifference. Today, I am here to speak truth to power because silence is no longer an option when the most vulnerable among us are suffering. A man who commits harm toward one of God's creations reveals much about his character. This video needs to be seen by everyone, particularly those who are in power to make changes. Local government, law enforcement, and church leaders. It shows a lack of empathy, compassion, and respect for life. It reflects a disconnection from the fundamental principle of stewardship over the earth and its creatures, which many believe is a divine responsibility. Such actions suggest an absence of understanding that all living beings are interconnected and deserving of dignity and care. Harming one of God's creations may also indicate unresolved personal issues, a disregard for moral or ethical values, or an inability to recognize the intrinsic value of life beyond one's own. It calls into question one's ability to fulfill the broader spiritual and moral obligations to love, protect, and nurture all that God has entrusted to humanity. Then what can be said about those who have the power to change how we protect God's creations? Example: our local government council members, leaders of law enforcement, church leaders. What does it say about us when those with power fail to protect the most vulnerable among God's creations? When those with the power to protect God's creations, such as local government council members, law enforcement leaders, and church leaders, fail to act, it speaks to a profound moral and ethical failing. Their inaction can be seen as a neglect of their responsibility to safeguard the vulnerable and uphold justice. For council members and government leaders, their silence or refusal to implement necessary ordinances reflects a disregard for the welfare of their community and a missed opportunity to lead with compassion and integrity. Their inaction perpetuates suffering and signals to others that the mistreatment of animals and neglect of environmental stewardship are acceptable. Council members who stand idly by while God's creations suffer are complicit in the atrocities they allow to persist. Their silence and inaction are a betrayal of their duty and a stain on their moral integrity. To fail to act when one has the power to protect is not just neglect, it is a willful choice to enable cruelty. For law enforcement leaders, failing to enforce or prioritize laws against animal abuse undermines public trust in their role as protectors of all life. It conveys that justice is selective, and that the suffering of voiceless creatures is not worthy of their attention or resources. Law enforcement leaders, including chiefs of police and sheriffs, who fail to protect and serve all of God's creations, betray the very oath they took to uphold justice and protect the vulnerable. Their refusal to act against animal abuse is a dereliction of duty that perpetuates suffering and emboldens cruelty. By turning a blind eye or deprioritizing these cases, they send a dangerous message that the lives of the voiceless are expendable. True leadership requires moral courage and a commitment to justice for all, human and animal alike. Their failure diminishes trust, undermines community values, and stands as a stark reminder of the cost of indifference. The excuses from law enforcement leaders, claiming a lack of resources, training, or that protecting animals isn't a priority, are nothing more than a shield for their inaction. These justifications ignore the fact that every act of cruelty left unchecked fosters a culture of violence that spills over into our communities. Resources are allocated to what leaders deem important. Failure to prioritize animal protection reveals a disturbing lack of empathy and vision. Training can be acquired and priorities can be shifted. What is truly missing is the will to stand up for the defenseless and honor the full scope of their duty to serve and protect. For church leaders, ignoring the plight of animals contradicts their calling to serve as moral and spiritual guides. By failing to acknowledge animals as part of God's creation deserving of care, They miss an opportunity to inspire their congregations to live out values of compassion, stewardship, and love. Church leaders who ignore the suffering of God's creations fail not only as spiritual guides, but as representatives of God's will on earth. Their refusal to acknowledge and advocate for all living beings is a betrayal of their calling and a distortion of the gospel's message of compassion, love, and stewardship. Such blindness to the plight of animals contradicts the very essence of their role as shepherds of the faithful. A leader who cannot see the value of all life should not stand in the pulpit, for their inaction speaks louder than their sermons. Their silence is a sin of omission that must be confronted and corrected if they are to truly serve God in their congregations. The inaction of government officials, law enforcement leaders, and church leaders in protecting God's creations is not only unacceptable, it is a moral failure of the highest order. Their refusal to act in the face of suffering defies the principles of justice, compassion, and stewardship they are entrusted to uphold. One day, they will stand before the Lord and answer for their choices, or lack thereof, when it came to safeguarding the voiceless and vulnerable. On that day, no excuses will suffice, and their failure to honor the Creator by protecting His creations will be laid bare. Let this be a call for accountability now, before it is too late.